The complexion of the workforce has changed recently thanks to a variety of equal opportunity legislation and perhaps some heightened awareness on the part of employer and employee alike. But according to some new research and a Harvard Business Review article by INSEAD Professor Herminia Ibarra, there's still a glass ceiling where women are concerned, and there's still a pretty big discrepancy in the salaries of men and women. Herminia joins us now on INSEAD Knowledge. Welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Why is there still a gender gap in today's workforce? Your research shows salaries and promotions are not equal.
So let's start with where the gaps are, because I think people ask themselves a lot of questions in that regard. We do see women entering the workforce at unprecedented levels. But the fact is that there's two gaps that really remain. One is the pay gap. And we know the famous statistics of 77 cents on the dollar, but that's a gap that we're actually seeing all over the world. And what's even more astonishing or disturbing is that we see it in cases where there really are equal credentials and equal background. I'll give you an example. INSEAD recently collaborated in a study with Catalyst looking at graduates of the top 25 business schools. Right out of MBA, right as they finish their degrees, there is a pay gap that occurs, and it's a pay gap of $4,600. And that is holding constant for position, because we do know that men enter often at higher levels, holding constant for position, for experience, for geography, and for industry. And industry is an important one because we know that part of that pay gap exists because women and men tend to enter different industries and different kinds of jobs. But accounting for all of that, holding all of that equal, there still remains a pay gap. So that's one. The other is the leadership gap. And no matter how you measure it or where you measure it, what you have is women entering at the entry level in pretty healthy numbers, a pretty good pipeline, and then no matter where you look or how you measure it, those numbers dwindle. They start getting smaller in the middle. There's a big exodus, and then when you look at the top, there's very few places where you see more than 13, 14, 15% women at the executive level.
Is that because of a lack of networking or mentoring, or why? It seems that we're perhaps childbearing.
There's really, at least in the research that we've been doing here, there's really three areas that we identify as the major obstacles. The first has to do with assignments that people get, and particularly assignments that they get at mid-career where they're given the chance or not to make their mark. Who's got the mission-critical assignments? Who's in the strategic roles, those pivotal jobs that end up being stepping stones to the top? And here we often see a very different allocation of those roles to men and to women. The second, and you alluded to this at the beginning, has to do with mentoring and sponsorship. What we saw in our study is that having a mentor in 2008 in this population of MBA graduates was predictive of getting a promotion in 2010, but only for the men. Women's mentors were helping them learn more about themselves, become more self-aware, develop themselves further, even get lateral moves. But men's mentors were sitting at the table, banging on the table, suggesting that they be promoted. And the third explanation is what I call the vision thing. And this has to do with assessments that are made about who has the potential to be effective at the senior executive level. One of the things that we've been looking at INSEAD is how senior executives are assessed on a range of leadership capacities. When they come here, they do a 360-degree assessment tool in which they themselves assess on these leadership dimensions, and their coworkers, whether bosses, peers, subordinates, also assess them on a range of different things, like having emotional intelligence, being able to reward and empower a team. And what we find in this very large database of executives is that women rate higher than men, or women executives rate higher than men executives on a lot of these different dimensions. Despite that, there was one very notable exception, and that had to do with what I'm calling the vision thing. It was a dimension called envisioning. And here, this had to do with the ability to sense trends in the external environment that have to do with the organization's strategic direction, to set that strategic direction and to communicate it in a compelling way. Interestingly, women were rated very highly on this by their women observers, but were rated lower by men. Now, you could say this is just one out of 10 dimensions that we measured, which is the positive side of the story. On the other hand, being visionary is almost a defining characteristic of leadership.
Why should corporations have more women? Why should they change their models? Why is it important?
For me, it's a pretty simple answer. If half the workforce, half the educated workforce is female, and in many countries it's going to be more than half. If you look at the projections for the OECD countries, pretty soon it's going to be 70% women coming out of higher education. Apart from that, there's been lots of studies showing a correlation between representation of women and corporate performance on a financial level. Most likely what you have is a situation where companies that are quite well managed are both having more women at all levels and also performing better relative to their counterparts. But if you look at the studies that are maybe a bit more smaller sample, a bit more in depth, what you start to see is that diversity of different kinds, and in particular intellectual diversity, because that's what you're trying to get at, but making sure that different kinds of people are represented, is correlated with greater creativity, a more effective decision-making process, more innovation. And that's really where the argument is. In today's day and age, if you don't have creativity and innovation, you just don't compete.
So is it a kind of different leadership style?
What we do know is that the more homogeneous a group, the more likely it is that someone can hijack opinion and take the group in a direction, whether positive or negative, but take the group with them. I think what we have seen, particularly with the financial crisis, that it behooves any executive team to have a culture in place and a capacity in place to consider options, consider consequences, and consider scenarios. I don't believe that women are necessarily better or worse at that, but I believe that any decision-making body has to be diverse in order for the decisions to be good decisions.
Is there any way that business schools can kind of further the idea of diversity, including more women in the workforce or women in leadership positions, or is there something that students should be learning today, perhaps that they're not?
Well, business schools are places where students see role models to the extent that we use case studies, for example, when we teach business school classes. The percentage of case studies that portray a woman CEO or a woman senior manager is dismally low. The number of women on business school faculties is also quite low. The number of women CEOs coming to visit students for conferences, for talks, is also quite low. I think we can play an enormous role by showing role models to outgoing MBA classes.
Do you believe in quotas to achieve those efforts, to reach those goals?
So quotas is a very charged and loaded word. I think it's a word that needs unpacking. It depends on what you mean by quotas. I've never known any business that didn't set goals on things that matter and didn't measure progress towards those goals. That I've never seen. So I don't understand why it is so controversial to set goals with regard to representation of women at different levels and to measure progress towards those goals. On the other hand, setting an arbitrary number, enforcing it at that very specific number and level can just backfire. But what I don't understand is why we haven't been able to move forward in setting very specific goals, rewarding people in organization for meeting those goals, and looking at what isn't working when they fail to meet those goals. I think that we can do very easily, and that's being done actually in a lot of organizations.
Finally, your outlook for women in the next 4 to 5 years. Is there any reason to be optimistic here?
So I'm of two minds on this, right? On the one hand, if you project out from the current trend of progress, the situation looks pretty depressing. The rate of progress that we've had has been pretty low, and we might simply continue at that kind of grinding pace. On the other hand, when you start to look at how global the business landscape has become and the incredible force in emerging economies, one of the things that strikes me, recently FT put out a list of the most powerful 50 women in business. Well, 6 of those women are Indian and 6 of them are Chinese. That's a large percentage. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think progress is going to move at different rates in different geographical areas. And I think everybody's looking towards what's happening in the emerging economies, and that might also be a boost for some of the efforts that are going on elsewhere.
Herminia Ibarra, thank you very much for being with us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thanks, Shelley.